Hello, this is Patient X Files, where the rare becomes real. Her brain was escaping. I never told anyone about what I saw that morning. How could I? How do you explain to someone that you watched a piece of human brain push through skin like a desperate prisoner breaking free from its cell? Sarah Martinez was 23 when her world cracked open. Literally. She was brushing her teeth. Same routine she'd done thousands of times before when she felt something shift behind her forehead. Not pain exactly, more like a whisper of wrongness that made her stomach drop. It felt like something was trying to crawl out of my skull, she would later tell me, her voice barely above a whisper. Like there was something alive in there that didn't belong. She pressed her fingers to her forehead and froze. There was a soft bulge just above her left eyebrow, pulsing gently with her heartbeat. Warm, alive, growing. Sarah had been born with encephalocele, though nobody knew it yet. Deep inside her skull, a tiny defect in the bone had been waiting 23 years to reveal itself. A microscopic gateway that would soon become a doorway for her brain tissue to escape its bony prison. Most people think of the skull as solid, impenetrable. But Sarah's skull had a secret, a hairline fracture in the frontal bone so small it had never shown up on any scan. Her parents had taken her to doctors as a baby when they noticed subtle asymmetries in her face, but every test came back normal. She's just unique, they were told. Some babies develop differently. But uniqueness sometimes comes with a price. The morning she felt that first shift, Sarah was 3 weeks away from her wedding. She had landed her dream job at a marketing firm. Life was finally clicking into place. She had no idea that inside her skull, pressure was building like water behind a dam about to burst. She called her fiancé first. "Mark, I think something's wrong with my forehead." "Wrong how?" Mark's voice was thick with sleep. "There's like a bump. It wasn't there yesterday. Maybe you hit your head. You've been stressed about the wedding." But Sarah knew this wasn't about wedding stress. This was about something fundamental breaking down inside her body. By afternoon, the bulge had doubled in size. By evening, it was the size of a golf ball, protruding from her forehead like a grotesque third eye. The skin stretched thin and translucent, revealing something pink and pulsing underneath. That's when she finally went to the emergency room. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been working emergency medicine for 15 years, but she had never seen anything quite like what walked through her doors that night. Sarah looked like she was growing a horn, except this horn was soft, warm, and unmistakably organic. "How long has this been developing?" Dr. Walsh asked, trying to keep her voice clinical and calm. "Since this morning," Sarah replied, and Dr. Walsh felt her own heartbeat quicken. "Growths didn't appear overnight, not like this." The CT scan revealed the impossible truth. Brain tissue had herniated through a previously unknown defect in Sarah's frontal bone. Her frontal lobe, the part of her brain responsible for personality, decision-making, and impulse control, was literally pushing its way out of her skull. "It's called an encephalocele," Dr. Walsh explained, though the words felt inadequate. "Brain tissue herniating through a skull defect." "But I'm 23, Sarah whispered. "How is this possible?" Here's where the story becomes truly unsettling. Encephaloceles usually manifest at birth. Babies are born with visible brain tissue protruding from their skulls, requiring immediate surgical intervention. But in rare cases, microscopic defects can remain dormant for decades, held in place by nothing more than skin and thin membrane, until something triggers them to open. Sarah's trigger had been stress. Not just wedding stress, but months of late nights, poor eating, and the kind of psychological pressure that makes your body forget how to regulate itself properly. Her blood pressure had been spiking, creating increased intracranial pressure. Her brain, desperate for space, had found the weakest point in her skull and pushed. But here's what makes Sarah's case extraordinary. As her brain tissue herniated, something unexpected happened. The protruding tissue began to interfere with her frontal lobe function, but in ways that were initially positive. Her anxiety disappeared completely. The wedding stress that had been consuming her for months simply evaporated. She felt calm, eerily calm, as if someone had adjusted the volume on her worry dial. "I know I should be terrified," she told Dr. Walsh, "but I'm not. I can't seem to feel fear about anything anymore. This should have been a red flag." But Sarah was experiencing what felt like liberation. For the first time in years, she wasn't overthinking every decision, wasn't paralyzed by what-if scenarios. She felt free. Mark noticed the change immediately. "It's like you're a different person," he said, and he wasn't wrong. The Sarah who had spent weeks agonizing over wedding flower arrangements had been replaced by someone who genuinely didn't care about flowers or seating arrangements or whether the caterer showed up with the right appetizers. But frontal lobe damage is never truly benign, even when it feels like relief. Within days, Sarah began making impulsive decisions. She quit her dream job via text message. She bought a motorcycle despite never having ridden one. She told her mother exactly what she thought about her passive-aggressive comments about the wedding venue. "It was like someone had removed my filter," Sarah later explained. "Every thought in my head just came pouring out." Her family watched in horror as Sarah's personality transformed. The cautious, thoughtful young woman they knew was disappearing, replaced by someone reckless and unpredictable. She was becoming a stranger in her own life. The wedding was postponed, not canceled, just postponed, because Sarah couldn't seem to focus on planning anything more than an hour in advance. Her attention span had shrunk to match the growing protrusion on her forehead. Meanwhile, the encephalocele continued to grow. What had started as a golf ball became the size of a small orange, forcing Sarah to wear loose hats whenever she went outside. The skin stretched thinner each day, sometimes so transparent that you could see the brain tissue pulsing underneath. Dr. Walsh referred Sarah to Dr. Michael Reeves, one of the few neurosurgeons in the country with experience in adult-onset encephaloceles. Dr. Reeves had seen exactly 3 cases like Sarah's in his 20-year career. "And the good news," he told Sarah and Mark, "is that this is surgically correctable. We can reposition the herniated tissue and repair the skull defect." "And the bad news?" Mark asked. "The brain tissue that's been outside the skull for weeks has been exposed to trauma, pressure changes, and potential infection. We won't know how much function can be recovered until after surgery." Sarah surprised everyone by laughing. Not the nervous laughter of someone processing difficult news, but genuine amusement. "You mean I might stay like this?" she asked, "without anxiety?" Dr. Reeves looked concerned. "Sarah, the changes you're experiencing aren't healthy. Your frontal lobe controls executive function, impulse control, social awareness. The damage could be permanent." But Sarah wasn't worried about executive function. She was worried about going back to being the anxious, overthinking person she had been before. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't paralyzed by decision-making. She wasn't lying awake at night catastrophizing about every possible negative outcome. She was, in her own words, finally free. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. But 3 days before the operation, Sarah made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She disappeared. Not missing person, disappeared. She left a note, packed a bag, and drove her new motorcycle to Colorado. She had decided she wanted to see the mountains before her brain was fixed. Mark was frantic. "She's not thinking clearly," he told Dr. Reeves. "This isn't who she really is. But what if it was? What if the Sarah they had known, the anxious perfectionist who second-guessed every decision, had been the damaged version? What if the encephalocele hadn't broken her brain but revealed who she actually was underneath all that overthinking?" Sarah spent a week in the Colorado mountains, hiking trails that the old Sarah would have researched for months before attempting. She slept under stars without worrying about weather forecasts. She talked to strangers without rehearsing conversations in her head. She also began experiencing severe headaches and episodes of confusion. The exposed brain tissue was swelling, creating pressure that manifested as blinding pain and moments where she couldn't remember where she was or why she was there. On her 7th day in Colorado, Sarah collapsed on a hiking trail. Another hiker found her unconscious, the encephalocele visibly inflamed and leaking clear fluid. She was airlifted to Denver General Hospital in critical condition. The Denver neurosurgical team performed emergency surgery, working to reduce the swelling and prevent infection. The operation saved her life, but it also meant that the definitive repair of her skull defect would have to wait until the inflammation resolved. Sarah spent 3 weeks in the Denver hospital, her personality fluctuating wildly as the swelling in her brain tissue increased and decreased. Some days she was the anxious perfectionist her family remembered. Other days she was the fearless adventurer who had bought a motorcycle on impulse. Mark flew to Denver and spent every day at her bedside, watching his fiancée cycle through different versions of herself like a radio searching for a clear signal. "Which one is really me?" she asked him during a lucid moment. It was a question that would haunt both of them for months. When Sarah was finally stable enough for transport, she returned home for the definitive surgery. Dr. Reeves would carefully reposition the herniated brain tissue, repair the skull defect with a titanium mesh, and hopefully restore normal function to her frontal lobe. The night before surgery, Sarah made a confession to Mark that broke his heart. "I'm terrified of going back to being anxious all the time," she whispered. "What if I can't handle normal life anymore? What if I need the anxiety to function?" Anxiety, she had realized, wasn't just an inconvenience. It was also what made her careful, thoughtful, considerate of others. Without it, she had become someone who made decisions without considering consequences, who spoke without thinking about impact. The surgery took 8 hours. Dr. Reeves meticulously repositioned the herniated tissue, removed damaged portions, and reconstructed the skull defect. The operation was technically successful, but the real question was whether Sarah would recover her cognitive function. She woke up 3 days later with a splitting headache and an overwhelming sense of anxiety about everything. The heart monitor, the IV line, the texture of the hospital blanket. Her mind was racing with worst-case scenarios about her recovery, her future, her relationship. Mark squeezed her hand. "How do you feel?" "Terrified," she said, and they both started crying. Because terrified was exactly how the old Sarah would have felt. Over the following months, Sarah slowly returned to something resembling her pre-encephalocele personality. The anxiety came back, but so did her ability to think through complex problems, to consider other people's feelings, to make thoughtful decisions. She never did complete the motorcycle course. The wedding was rescheduled again, this time with Sarah obsessing over every detail just like before. But now she and Mark both understood that her anxious perfectionism wasn't a character flaw to be fixed. It was part of the neural architecture that made her who she was. Sarah returned to work, though she switched to a less stressful position. She learned meditation and started therapy to help manage her anxiety in healthier ways. She kept the motorcycle, but it stayed in the garage as a reminder of the 3 weeks when her brain had literally escaped her skull and given her a glimpse of a completely different version of herself. The titanium mesh in her skull set off airport security scanners, requiring her to carry medical documentation whenever she traveled. She told people she had a plate in her head from a motorcycle accident, which wasn't entirely untrue. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would run her fingers over the scar on her forehead and remember what it felt like to make decisions without fear, to speak without filtering, to exist without the constant hum of anxiety in the background. She never missed that feeling more than when she was lying awake at 3 a.m., her mind racing through every possible thing that could go wrong tomorrow. "Do you ever wish it hadn't been fixed?" Mark asked her one evening 6 months after the surgery. Sarah considered the question carefully, just like the old Sarah would have. "I wish I could find a middle ground," she said finally. "Between the person who was paralyzed by anxiety and the person who didn't feel fear at all. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not getting back to who you were before, but learning to be someone new." The encephalocele had been repaired, but Sarah's understanding of herself had been permanently altered. She had learned that personality isn't as fixed as we like to believe, that the voice in our head telling us what to do and how to feel is just electrical signals in brain tissue, and brain tissue can be damaged, displaced, or changed. She had also learned that sometimes our perceived weaknesses are actually the mechanisms that keep us safe, connected, and human. Sarah and Mark were married 18 months after her original diagnosis, in a small ceremony that Sarah planned with meticulous attention to detail. She worried about the weather, the flowers, and whether the photographer would capture the right moments. It was exactly the kind of wedding the old Sarah would have wanted, organized by the new Sarah who understood that anxiety and love often occupy the same neural pathways. During their first dance, Mark whispered in her ear, "I love every version of you I've met." Sarah smiled and whispered back, "Even the one with brain tissue growing out of her forehead." "Especially that one," he said. "She's the one who taught you to be brave." Today, Sarah works as an advocate for people with rare neurological conditions. She speaks at medical conferences about the psychological impact of sudden personality changes caused by brain trauma. She tells her story to help other people understand that our sense of self is more fragile and fluid than we want to believe. But she also tells them that fragility isn't weakness. Sometimes breaking open is how we discover what we're really made of. The encephalocele changed Sarah's brain structure permanently. The titanium mesh will be part of her skull for the rest of her life. But more significantly, the experience gave her a profound understanding of the relationship between neurology and identity. She learned that we are not just our thoughts and feelings. We are also the physical structures that generate those thoughts and feelings. And sometimes when those structures are altered, we get the rare opportunity to meet different versions of ourselves. Sarah keeps a small mirror in her purse now, not for vanity, but as a reminder. Every morning she looks at her reflection and asks herself, "Who am I today?" It's a question most people never have to consciously consider. But for someone who has watched their brain literally escape their skull and then return home changed, It's the most important question in the world. Because identity isn't just about who we are. It's about who we choose to become when everything we thought we knew about ourselves turns out to be negotiable. Sarah's encephalocele was repaired, but her perspective was permanently expanded. She had learned that the mind is not separate from the body, that personality can be altered by pressure and chemistry and the precise positioning of neural tissue. Most importantly, she had learned that healing doesn't always mean returning to your original state. Sometimes healing means integrating all the different versions of yourself you've discovered along the way. The scar on her forehead faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But the experience of having her brain push through her skull and change her fundamental sense of self left marks that would never completely disappear. And Sarah was grateful for every single one of them. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel. Like, share, and subscribe. Please write a comment what you think about this video.